Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make this crater balls effect in Blender using geometry nodes. It's a pretty gnarly effect. If you've got trypophobia, look away now. So without further ado, let's get to it. So open up Blender, we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons, search for Node, and then enable the Node Wrangler here. Once you've enabled that, click this button and click Save Preferences, and that will ensure the Node Wrangler loads every time you load Blender. We'll just close this window, navigate to your Output tab. Over here, enable Render Region and change the frame rate to 30 frames per second, and we'll change the end frame to 503 frames. I'll just go back into my render settings over here. I'm going to take my cursor to the bottom left until I see a crosshair. I'll left click, drag, and open up a new window. I'll then click this button here. I'll change it from the 3D viewport to the timeline. With my cursor over the timeline, I'm going to hit N to hide the end panel. I'm also going to collapse this menu over here. I'll just zoom out so I've got the entire timeline in my scene. I'll then take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see the crosshair. I'll left click and drag up and open up another new window. I'll click this button here and I'm going to change it from 3D viewport to geometry node editor. I'll click N to hide the end panel. I'll then take my cursor to the outliner. I'm going to select the default light and I'll click delete. I'll select the default cube and I'll rename this to crater balls. I'm going to go to my geometry node editor. I'll click new and I'll rename the geometry nodes to crater balls. I'll then select my camera in the outliner. I'm going to go to my camera data down here. Ensure that your focal length is set to 50mm, and then we'll go back up to our render tab up here. I'll then reselect the crater balls object. I'm going to shrink this window just to give us a bit more room. Maybe I'll zoom out a bit. Maybe I'll reduce the timeline. I'm going to delete the group input. I hit Shift A and I'm going to search for Ico for icosphere, and we'll add an icosphere here. I'm going to change the subdivisions to 2. I'll then connect the mesh socket to the geometry socket of the group output. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for dual mesh, and we'll add a dual mesh and we'll pop that in between there. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for EX for extrude, and we'll choose extrude mesh and I'll pop that in there. As you can see in our 3D viewport, the extrude mesh has extruded each individual face, and if I adjust the offset you can see that it changes the extrusion amount. So I want to drive this with a random value node, so I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for random, and then we'll add a random value node. I'll then take the value socket and plug it into the offset scale. For the minimum, I'm going to set this to 0.2, and for the max, I'm going to set to 0.5. I want a final level of control, so I'm going to remap these values. So I hit Shift A and I'm going to search for map, and we'll add a map range node and we'll pop it in between there. From min, I'm going to set to 0.1. From max, I'm going to set to 0.5. To min, I'm going to set to 0.075. And to max, I'll set to 0.2. I now want to scale these faces, so I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for scale, and we'll choose scale elements, and I'll pop that at the end of the extrude mesh. If we change the scale factor, it adjusts the scale for the entire object. I don't want that. I just want the scale to affect on these top faces which we extruded. To do that, we can use this top socket from the extrude mesh and plug it into the selection. And now, if I adjust the scale, it's only scaling the top faces of the extrusions. Excellent. I want to adjust this scale based on the extrusion value here. So I'm going to take this value node and I'm going to plug it into the scale factor of the scale elements. And to give this a final level of control, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to type in math, and we'll add a math node. I'll change it from add to multiply, and I'll pop this between the random value node and the scale elements node. I'll just drag this down here, and maybe I'll set a value of 1.5. That should do for now. And because these are going to be craters, I want to extrude these top faces inwards one more time. So I'm going to take this extrude mesh, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop it at the end of the node tree there. It looks a complete mess at the moment because it's actually scaling on every single face. We don't want that, we just want to extrude on the top faces. So again, we can take this top face selection here and we'll plug it into the selection of this extrude mesh. And now the extrusions are only happening on the top faces. I want to give this offset random values, so I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for random, and then we'll add another random value node and we'll pop it there. I'm going to plug this into the offset scale, and for the min, I'm going to type in -0.4, and for the max, I'm going to type in -0.5. Now I want to change the scale of these inner faces. So I'm going to take this scale elements node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop that at the end of the node tree there. If I change the scale, it will change the scale for the entire object, so we can use the top face selection from this extrude mesh and plug it into the selection, and now we can adjust the scale of the faces individually. Excellent. I'll keep that at level 1 for now. Next up, I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to search for sub, and we'll add a subdivision surface, and I'll pop that at the end of the node tree there. For the final, I'm going to set this to something like 4, but for now, I'm just going to keep it at 2. So this concludes the first section of the geometry nodes. So I'm going to box select all of these nodes here. I'm going to hit Ctrl J, and that will add a frame. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel, and I'll navigate to the tab where it says Node. I'll then enable color. I'll expand these options here, and I'm going to give it a color, something around maybe there perhaps. I'll then hit F2, and I'm going to rename the frame to Craters. I hit N to hide the N panel, and I'll zoom out. I'll select the group output, and I'll hit G, and I'll just bring this across over to here. Now we want to instance some icospheres inside these craters. Let's do that now. So I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to search for separate, and we'll choose separate geometry, and I'll pop that in there. Maybe I'll just drag this down to here. We want to change it from point to face because we want to separate the faces, and the faces we want to separate will be these top faces here. So I'll plug this into the selection. The idea here is we want to instance icospheres on the inner faces, but if we've done that now, the icospheres would instance on each of these points, and we don't want that, so we need to instance them before the subdivision surface. So I'm going to take this mesh socket and I'm going to connect this into the geometry socket of the separate geometry, and now we can instance the icospheres in the center of each face, but we still want this original geometry. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for join, and we'll choose join geometry, and I'll pop that in there. I'll then take the selection socket from the separate geometry and plug it into the bottom socket of the join geometry node. Just to make this easy to read, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag across these two noodles. I'll then hit G and bring these two control points over to here. Maybe I'll select this one. I'll hit G, just bring this across, just to separate them a bit, just so we can see where everything's going. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for mesh, and we'll choose mesh to points, and I'll pop that in there. We want to generate the points on the faces, so I'm going to change this from vertices to faces. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for instance, and we'll choose instance on points, and I'll pop that at the end there. And the instance object, I'm going to choose an icosphere, so I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'll search for icosphere, and we'll add an icosphere, and we'll put it there. I'll then connect this mesh socket into the instance socket. I'll then change the scale for the X, Y, and Z to 0.1. I'm going to increase the subdivision on the icosphere to, let's say, 2 for now. For the final, I'll set this to 4. I want to drive the scale of these icospheres with the same values as we used to drive the size of these craters. And if you remember, back here, that should come from this multiply node. So I'm going to take this value from this multiply node, and I'm going to plug it into the scale of this instance on points node. And to give it a final level of control, I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to search for math, and we'll add a math node, and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then drag this down over to here. I'm going to change it from add to multiply, and now the scale of these icospheres should match the scale of the craters. Excellent. I'll just neaten these nodes up a bit. So that's the second part of the node structure. So I'm going to box select all of these nodes here. I'm going to hit Ctrl J, and that will add a frame. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel, and on your node tab over here, enable color, and I'll change the color to, let's say, a blue color, something around there. I'll then hit F2, and I'll rename the frame to instance spheres in craters. Maybe I'll just shift select these two control points here. I'll then hit G, Y, just bring them up to around about there. For this multiply node, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag just to add a control point there. I'll then hit G. I'll bring this across over to around about there just for readability. Excellent. I'll then hit N to close the N panel. The next part of this geometry node structure is we need to change the position of these icospheres. So I'll just box select these two nodes here. I'll hit G. I'll bring this across over to around about there, just to give us a bit of room. Shift A, I'm going to search for set, and we'll choose set position, and I'll pop that there. Now, if I was to change the offset, you can see that all the icospheres are moving simultaneously. We need to calculate the center of all these icospheres so we can offset them from the center radially. To do that, I'm just going to hit Shift A, I'm going to search for vector, and we'll add a vector math node. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to search for position, and we'll choose position. I'll just drag this over to here. I'll drag this up here. I'll connect the position socket into the top socket of the vector math node. I'll then plug this vector math node into the position socket of the set position. I'll then hit Shift D and duplicate that math node. I'll change it from add to scale. Shift D to duplicate that vector math node, and I'm going to change it from scale to normalize. I'll just drag these across. I'll then take this position node. I'll hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop this over here. I'll connect this position socket into the vector of the normalize. I'll take the vector socket from the normalize into the vector of the scale. I'll then connect the scale vector into this vector here. So now, if I change the scale, you can see that they're all radiating outward. Excellent. I want to drive this scale with random values, so again I'll hit Shift A and I'll search for random and I'll choose random value and I'll pop that there. I'll plug the value from the random value into the scale socket, and for minimum I'm going to type in 0.1 and for maximum I'm going to type in 0.5. I'll just neaten up these nodes quick. I'll just box select these nodes, I'm going to hit G, bring them across over to around about here just to give us a bit of space. So I think we've got one more element to do. So we managed to change the offset of all these. I want to be able to animate the offset of these icospheres randomly. So I'm going to add a master controller for this. So I'm going to select this scale node here. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. And I'm going to pop that in between this scale node and this add node. And we can use a wave texture to drive this scale factor here. Clearly the icospheres are way off scale. So I'm just going to navigate over to the instance spheres in craters. And for this multiply node, I'm just going to reduce the value to, let's say, maybe a value of 0.25. Okay, that looks about right. Excellent. I'm going to box select all of these nodes here. I'm going to hit Control J to add a frame. I'll hit N to open up the N panel. I'm going to enable color and I'm going to change the color to something around about there perhaps. I'll then hit F2 and I'll rename the frame to sphere position. I'll then hit N to hide the N panel. Next up, we're going to add a few nodes so we can drive this scale factor here. So these balls animate randomly, but we also want the animation to loop seamlessly. That's easy enough. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for wave and we'll choose wave texture. Shift A, search for position, and then we'll add a position node. I'll just drag this wave texture down to give us a bit more room. I'm going to connect the position socket into the vector of the wave texture node. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for vector and we'll choose vector math. I'm going to change it from add to normalize and I'll plug the position socket into the vector of the normalize node. I'll then duplicate this normalize node, Shift D to duplicate. I hit Shift D to duplicate it again and Shift D to duplicate it one more time. For this normalize node, I'm going to change it from normalize to multiply. And for this one, I'm going to change it from normalize to scale. I'll then take this position node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop that up here. I'll connect this vector into the top socket of this multiply node and the color from this wave texture into the bottom socket of this multiply node. I'll then take this vector socket and connect it into the vector socket of this scale node. I'll then change this vector math node from normalize to multiply add. I'll connect the position socket into the top vector and I'll take this vector from the scale node into the multiplier. I can then use this vector to plug into the scale of this scale node here. So I'll box select these nodes here, I'm going to hit G, just bring them across over to around about there. I'll then connect this vector into the scale socket of this scale node here. And for the addend, I'm going to type in 0.5 for X, Y and Z. Maybe I can adjust the scale, so I'm going to change the scale of this to 10. Okay, looking promising. I'm going to change the scale of the wave texture to 1000. I'll set the distortion to 5, detail to 5, detail scale to 5, detail roughness to 5. And now if we change the phase offset, you can see that the balls are popping in and out randomly. Excellent. So I'm going to go to my timeline. I'm going to make sure that I'm on frame 1 and I've got 503 frames on my timeline. And then for the phase offset, I'm going to type in hash frame divide by 10 and then hit enter, and that will add a driver. I can now hit play and you can see that the icospheres pop in and out of the craters randomly. Excellent. And if I skip close to the end frame, I hit play, it should loop seamlessly. Excellent. So I'll just zoom out a bit. I'm going to box select all of these nodes here. I'm going to hit Control J to add a frame. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel, enable color, and I'm going to choose a color, maybe something around there perhaps. I'll then hit F2 and we'll rename the frame to wave texture movement. I'll hit N to hide the N panel. I'll zoom out and I'll go over to here to my join geometry node. I'll just bring the group output over to here. Maybe I'll bring the join geometry over to here. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for set and I'm going to choose set shade smooth and I'll pop that after the join geometry node. It's time to give these materials. Obviously we want the icospheres to have a different material to the crater object. I'll navigate over to my material tab over here, and the first material, I'm going to rename this to material 1. I'll then click this plus button to add a new material. I'll click new and I'll rename this material to material 2. For material 1, I'm just going to change the base color to black. In the geometry nodes window, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for set and we'll choose set material. And I'll plug this into the top noodle here. I'll then select that material, which will be material 1. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate that node and I'll pop that in between the spheres and the join geometry. I'm going to change this material to material 2. maybe I'll just box select all of these nodes here. I'm going to hit G, just bring these down to around about there. Your node tree should look something like this. I think I'll just expose a couple of values. I'm going to expose the subdivisions for the icospheres. I'll also expose the subdivision levels for the crater object. I'm going to do that now. So I hit Shift A, I'm going to search for group, and I'm going to choose group input. I'll then navigate to my modifier tab over here. I'll then connect the subdivisions from this icosphere and plug it into the bottom socket of the group input. I'll also take the subdivision levels from the craters and plug it into the same socket. I'll select the group input node. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel. I'm going to click group, navigate to where it says group socket. I'm going to expand these options down here. I'm going to select the subdivision socket. I'm going to set a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 4. I'll then hit enter. And the reason I set a value of 4 is so we can't crash Blender when we drag these values. And 4 should be more than sufficient. Okay, I'll just zoom out. I'm going to take this group input node. I'm going to hit G and I'm going to bring it down to around about there. I'll just hit N to hide the N panel. I'll then change this window from the geometry node editor to the shader editor. Before we continue, I'm just going to click File, I'm going to choose Save As, and I'm going to save my project as like and subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. And then just click Save As. I'll set my camera up before we continue with the shader editor. With the Creator Balls object selected, I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I hit numpad period to center our camera to the object. I'll then hit Ctrl Alt numpad 0, and that will align the camera to the view. I'll then select my camera. I'm going to go to my object data tab, and for the X location I'm going to type in 0. For the Y location I'm going to type in -10, and for the Z location I'm going to type in 0. And that will ensure everything's in frame. I'll then select the creatable object. I'm going to increase my shader editor window. I'm going to go into viewport shading, and for slot 1, which is material 1 with the base color set to black, I'm going to change the roughness all the way up to 1. I'll then change it from slot 1 to slot 2. I'm going to set the roughness to 0. I'll then hit Shift A, search for color, and we'll choose color ramp, and I'll pop that there. I'll then hit Shift A, search for object, and we'll choose object info, and I'll pop that there. I'm going to change the color ramp interpolation type from linear to constant. I'll then click this plus button to add a new flag, and for this first flag here I'm going to set this to a blue color, maybe something around there perhaps. For the second flag I'm going to turn this to a pink color, maybe something around there perhaps. I'll select this first flag and I'm going to change this colour to a yellow colour, something around there. I'll drag this pink flag across, I'll drag this yellow flag across, and maybe I'll set this to 0.575. I'm going to connect the colour socket from the colour ramp into the base colour of the principal BSDF. I'll then connect this random socket into the factor of the colour ramp. I'm going to take this colour ramp, I'm going to hit Ctrl Shift D, and that will duplicate the colour ramp whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node. I'll pop that down there. I'll select the pink flag and I'll click the minus button to delete that flag, and for the blue flag we'll turn this to black, and for this yellow flag we're going to turn this to white, so I'll turn the saturation all the way down. I'll then plug the colour socket into the metallic socket of the principal BSDF. I'll then hit Ctrl Shift D to duplicate that node whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node. I'll expand the emission socket on the principal BSDF. I'll then connect the colour socket from the colour ramp into the strength of the emission. I'll then hit Shift A, search for math, and we'll select the math node, and I'll pop that in between the colour ramp and the principal BSDF. I'm going to change it from add to multiply, and I'm going to give a value of, let's say, 5. So now the strength will be a value of 5. I'm going to zoom into this bottom colour ramp. I'll click the plus button twice to add 2 more flags. This flag I'm going to change to 100% white. I'll then drag this flag all the way across over to here. I'll drag this black flag across, and I'll drag this one across to round about there. So the idea here is I want a balance of emissive and non-emissive materials. So maybe I'll just tweak these flags until I've got something that I like. So I want an equal balance of pink, blue, gold and white. So now I'm going to go over to rendered view. I'm going to go to my render settings tab over here. I'm going to change it from Eevee to cycles. I'll change my noise threshold to 0.025, and I'm going to change the max samples to 256. That should be more than enough for this scene. I'll then navigate to where it says light paths. I'll expand these options. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to disable reflective and refractive caustics. I'll then navigate to my world tab over here, and I'm going to turn the strength all the way down to 0. I'm going to light my scene using an HDRI. You can get free HDRIs from a website called Polyhaven, so just type in polyhaven.com, go to assets, HDRs, and then scroll down and find an HDR that you like, maybe something like that for example. you choose your resolution. I'm going to go for an 8K, choose your format, and then click download. I'm going to change my shader editor from object to world. I'll then hit numpad period and zoom into the world nodes. And with the background node selected, I'm going to hit Ctrl T, and that will add a texture coordinate, a mapping, and an environment texture node. I'll then click open. I'll select an HDR. Mine's called Falsa Forest 01, and I'm using an 8K texture. You can find that on Polyhaven with a quick search. I'll then click open image, and I'm going to set a background strength of 4. I'll then navigate to my render tab over here. I'm going to scroll down until I can see film. I'll expand these options and I'm going to enable transparent. Maybe I'll decrease this window just so we can see what we're doing a bit better. I'll change the shader editor from world back to object. I'm not entirely happy with the distribution of emission, so maybe I'll just increase this window here. I'm going to go to my emission color ramp down here, and I'm going to adjust these flags until I've got something that I like. Maybe something around there perhaps. Okay, I'm happy with that. Maybe I'll change the strength to 10. Okay, excellent. I'll just go into viewport shading. I'm going to go to my compositing tab up here. I'm going to click use nodes. I'll then hit N to open up the N panel. I'll navigate to the view tab over here. Make sure that you've got backdrop enabled. And with my render layer node selected, I'm going to hit Control Shift left click select, and that will add a viewer node. I'll just drag this down to here. I'll then hold down Shift, right click and drag, and that will add a control point in between the two noodles. Zoom out. I'm going to bring this across over to here. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for alpha, and we're going to choose the alpha over node, and I'll pop that there. I'll then take this image noodle and I'll plug it into the bottom socket, and for the top socket I'm going to turn this to black. I'll just go back to my layout view over here. I'm going to hit F12 and that will render out a preview. Okay, I'll close this window. I'll then navigate to my compositing tab over here, and on your N panel with the view tab selected, click fit, and that will ensure that the image fits your compositor. I'll then hit N to hide the N panel. I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go filter, and I'm going to choose sunbeams. Shift A, color, and we'll choose mix, and we'll choose mix color. And I'll pop the mix color in between the alpha over and the composite. I'll then plug the image from the alpha over into the image of the sunbeams, and the image socket from the sunbeams into the second image socket of the color mix node. I'll then change the ray length to 0.5. I want to blur those rays, so I'm going to hit Shift A, filter, and I'm going to choose blur and blur. And I'll pop that in between the sunbeams and the mixed color node. Change it from Gaussian to fast Gaussian. We'll enable relative. I'll then change the X and Y to 2.5%. We only want a subtle effect. Less is more. So I'm going to reduce the factor on the mixed color node to 0.025. Excellent, looking good so far. So if you're happy with your composite, navigate back to your layout tab over here. Navigate to your output settings over here, choose a file output location, click this button here, choose an output location where you want to save your image sequence, and then click accept. If you're happy with your final result, you can choose a file format of PNG. I'm going to change my file format from PNG to OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will reduce my file size whilst increasing my dynamic range for post-production. I'll then hit Ctrl S to save the project. I'm going to go to my modifiers. Just make sure I've got my subdivisions set to 4. Before we render this out, we'll just do one more thing. So I'm going to skip back to frame 1. I'm going to go to my object data over here, and with your creatable object selected, I'm going to go over to the rotation, and I'm going to add a keyframe on X and Y. I'll then skip to the last frame. I'm going to skip one more frame, so we're on frame 504. And for the rotation of X and Y, I'm going to type in 360. I'll then add a keyframe on X and add a keyframe on Y. I'll then take my cursor to my timeline. I'll then hit A a couple of times until all the keyframes are selected. I'll hit T and I'm going to choose linear. And now if I scrub the timeline, you can see that the creatable object is rotating. Excellent. I'll just skip back to frame 1. I'm going to decrease this window here. I'm going to hit Ctrl S, and then it's simply a case of hitting Ctrl F12, and that will render out your image sequence. If you join me on Patreon as a free member, you'll have access to this file alongside other Blender files from previous episodes. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.